This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Charles Elton. Charles was a designer and editor in publishing before he became a director of the Curtis Brown Literary Agency. He's worked in television and been an executive producer on drama for ITV. He has also written several novels, including Mr. Toppit, but I'm talking to him today because of his new book, a biography of one of the most mysterious, dark, and interesting figures to come out of the new Hollywood 1970s moment of great creativity and originality in American cinema, Michael Cimino, with his new book, Cimino, The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate, and the Price of a Vision. It's going to be a truly interesting conversation about a fascinating subject. If you like it, please remember to like, share, subscribe, do all those things you have to do in order to make this podcast the growing success that it has become. Thanks very much to you, dear listener. You can follow me on Twitter, if you like, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
I mean, really, I'm not a biographer. I mean, I've written a biography. I'm really a drama producer, and I've written a couple of novels. And what was nice about this, it was sort of like a novel.
Absolutely, and what a character! What a character
Amazing,
to have at the centre.
Amazing.
How did you sort of fix on Cimino as a subject?
Well, I to be honest, I couldn't think of an idea for a novel, and a friend of mine suggested Cimino. And I'm a total showbiz junkie. It is literally the only thing I know anything about. I can't do Kings and Queens of England. And, when I was 10, I was seeing like 100 films. I've seen everything. And I have one of those sort of Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man kind of memory. So I can reel off people's credits, etc. So, of course, I knew a lot about Cimino, but I didn't know certainly as much as I knew when I finished it. And I just knew he was a really interesting figure because there's nobody else like him. I'm not saying he is the greatest director in the world, but he's certainly, for me, probably the most interesting director in the world because of his life and his work. And so I just began, I went out to LA for a while and got in touch with people. Nearly everybody was happy to talk. And so I just sort of fiddled around with it for a bit. And then sort of just, I got into it and really started doing it. And I went to LA, 3-4 times into New York where there were people. And what it essentially meant was that I hung out in LA talking about movies to movie people, which is literally my favorite thing in the world. And I met Roger, had dinner with Roger Corman, James Harris, who did those early Kubrick things like Lolita and Paths of Glory, Al Ruddy, who produced The Godfather. It was just, I had such a good time doing it. And I wish I had a kind of backstory of my pain and what a nightmare it was, but not at all.
All those lunches. Oh.
Yes, it was fabulous.
Did your life ever sort of brush against Cimino's while he was alive?
No, not at all. Well, no. I mean, the first person I interviewed, who's in the book, I mean, I had two weird strokes of luck, essentially. The mother of one of my oldest friends, Eleanor Fazan, choreographed the Oxford Round the Tree dance thing. And when I was an agent, which I used to represent her, so I knew her really well. So that was one amazing stroke of luck. And the other one, bizarrely, my brother-in-law wrote Desperate Hours, and he has a writing partner. And when I saw Larry, called Lawrence Connor, who wrote the recent Sopranos, not very good Sopranos movie with David Chase, and I adore him. And so we're having dinner, and he said, well, the trouble is I don't remember anything at all. But he put me in touch with his writing partner, who co-wrote Desperate Hours with him, and he remembered everything. So that was all right. But that seemed two amazing strokes of luck. And in terms of how I got into the book, I always sort of thought I couldn't do it unless I tracked down Joanne Corelli. Joanne Corelli was with Cimino for 50 years in some form or other, and she produced Heaven's Gate. And she knew everything. Obviously, she was with him for 50 years, from about 1967 till when he died in 2016. However, she had never talked, ever. And in fact, Eleanor Fazan, the choreographer of the Round the Tree sequence, to my astonishment, she really liked Joanne and Michael, because many, many people didn't, particularly Joanne. People in Hollywood really don't like her. And I'd written to her 3, 4, 5 times. I found various addresses and I kind of letterbombed her. No answer. And when I discovered that Eleanor Fazan had been friends with her, and Michael and Joanne had stayed in Eleanor's flat, and I wrote to Joanne, and so I wrote to Joanne and said, I'm a friend of Eleanor Fazan, you'll remember, blah, 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 blah. And to my amazement, she called me. And we talked for about an hour. She began by saying, she has a very kind of New York Italian voice. She said, I'm not telling you anything. But we talked for an hour, and I was going to be in New York next week, the week after. And she agreed to have dinner with me. And we formed an odd kind of relationship. But I had dinner with her 6 or 7 times over 18 months. And each one lasted till the waiters were putting the chairs on the table. But she did stick to her thing, which is, I'm not telling you anything. But of course, she did tell me things. But she certainly wouldn't go into personal details. She believes that she's totally the keeper of the flame. She believes that everything that has ever been written about Cimino is a lie. But we had a kind of cautious relationship. And actually, though she is a very abrasive, tough, frankly, quite terrifying woman, she's like 80, I grew fond of her. And I think in her way, she grew fond of me. And, she would call me, like out of the blue, she'd call me in London, where I live, and ramble for about an hour. But so, as I say, it isn't exactly that she told me that much, but just she's a legendary, mysterious figure. And just by being with her, I kind of, I guess, like osmosis. And so once I got to her, then I kind of went on with it. And I made the decision that I wouldn't bother with the actors. I did talk to some of, like 3 or 4 actors, like John Savage, who, was in Heaven's Gate, the one who became paraplegic, because it's always a nightmare. You have to go to their agents and they're free or they're not free, or they will talk or they won't talk, or they say they'll talk and then they don't talk. And also, in my, having worked with actors all my life, they never actually say anything that's very interesting. They always love the director. And the people who were absolute gold dust were the secretaries, the assistants, particularly the editorial assistants, or the editors too, because I talked to some of his editors, because they sat in a darkened room with him for a year. They know where the bodies are buried. And I found when I went to Kalispell, where they shot Heaven's Gate, I found the person who had driven him for 7 months. They are the people who know stuff. And that is where I got, all the interesting stuff from. I mean, obviously I knew he was a fascinating figure, but more than that, I've always thought that failure is more interesting than success. And I don't quite mean he failed, because obviously he didn't fail with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot and Deer Hunter and Heaven's Gate, though I think he failed with the other films. I mean, failure for your life to live up to your expectations. And, failure is instructive, success is kind of inspirational. But, in terms of people one might write about, I mean, their lives rather than a straight film book. I mean, Steven Spielberg, I'm not saying he isn't a great filmmaker, but he's not actually that interesting as a person. Ditto, do you want to read a biography of Sidney Pollack? I mean, you probably do, because you're a film buff, and I want to read a biography of Sidney Pollack. But you know what I mean? It isn't, there's nothing there really, except their films. Okay, they may have had a divorce or two, whatever, but that isn't necessarily interesting. And I loved, sort of like Orson Welles, though of course Orson Welles is unlike anybody else and a greater filmmaker, that thing about both of them had the world in their hands after Citizen Kane and after Deer Hunter, and they let it slip away. And I mean, you could argue that Cimino let it slip away because he'd done Heaven's Gate, which was such a giant flop. But even Orson Welles, with Magnificent Ambersons, he went off to Brazil to shoot that Everything Is True, or whatever, that sort of documentary about the carnival in Rio. And he just sort of assumed that his cut would be fine because nobody would tamper with it. And they did tamper with it. So he didn't let it slip through his hands exactly the same way, but he took his eye off the ball and nothing was ever the same again. He never had really any power. I mean, he had kind of power when he did Othello and Chimes of Midnight. So he had power, but he didn't have any money, which is a problem, which is why they were shot, like scenes were shot 5 years apart. I'm not saying they're not great movies, but he never really had power. And you see Orson Welles, who is the most incredible character, but you see him, you can get it on YouTube, you can see at the end of his life doing those Gallo wine commercials. And there's one particular one where a camera is running on set and he is completely pissed, trying to do the thing. And it's sad. And Cimino's later life was sad in a different kind of way, but just as sad. And I think, and maybe I don't accentuate the positive. I just think the positive is so much less interesting than the negative, I suppose.
I had a friend who knew Cimino called Massimo Benvenu. He's I think he works in Amsterdam now at the ICE, and he told me that that Cimino told him, I learned how to make movies by making my first my second two movies, really, and I learned how to make a movie, and then they wouldn't let me make a movie for the rest of my life. That was the.
Of course, like anything Cimino said, that's not totally true. I mean, where he learned how to make movies, the commercials he did in New York, you can get them on YouTube. There's 3 or 4. So that's where he learned it. But what is true is that he wasn't that interested in movies. He wasn't a movie brat, like De Palma and Scorsese and Spielberg, who hung around and watched old Jean-Luc Godard movies and knew everything and understood, Abel Gance and the silent movies. He wasn't like that at all. I'm not saying that means he can't be a great filmmaker, but he came from a different kind of tradition, and he was always an outsider. I mean, partly because of his kind of spiky personality, he was always an outsider.
That personality is something that I guess we all know from various sort of portrayals of him sort of having shouting fits and behaving badly on set and everything.
But one of the things I wanted to do, I mean, Final Cut, which you will know and lots of people will know, it is a great gossipy book, and it is pure pleasure reading it. But as I say in my book, I think Stephen Bach was a tarnished figure, and he has a slant on it that is very, very self-serving. He doesn't exactly not take the blame, but he kind of couches it in other things. And one of the great strokes of luck I had was finding his partner, I don't mean his partner, but the other executive on the movie, who's called David Field, and they were equally in charge. And David Field wouldn't be involved with the book, fell out with Stephen Bach, and he was very interesting in giving another slant to the book, because the other great movie books, which you will have read, Bonfire of the Vanities, not Bonfire of the Vanities, The Devil's Candy, about
Julie Salomon.
Salomon, yeah. And there are several other books, but they are journalists who are impartial. And I'm not saying if you are part of a process, you can't write a book about it. I'm not saying you have to be impartial, but I think if you're not impartial, it's not quite as valuable somehow, which isn't to say the book isn't a lot of fun, because it is, and I've read it, a lot of times. But so I wanted to put Cimino into context, particularly Stephen Bach's book. He wasn't very experienced, which he admitted. So all the problems that came up, he talks about them as if like this is the first time in movie history that these amazing things happened, that there might be budget problems. I mean, there is no movie ever made that doesn't have some kind of budget problems. Cimino behaving badly on set, try working with Erich von Stroheim. That's what directors do. They behave badly, or they can behave badly. And as somebody said to me, if you want a pleasant experience on a movie, hire a Sunday school teacher to make it. That's what it's a battlefield often. And even if it's a pleasant experience, which sometimes it is, there are a lot of battles along the way, and the battles might be handled better by other people than Cimino. But, David leaned on Ryan's daughter. It was in principal photography for a year when there was that big storm sequence, and he hung around in Ireland, but, inevitably the storm didn't come. And he picked up the entire crew, flew them to South Africa. I mean, God knows how much that added to the budget. That's what they do. And the other thing that always surprises me is that people expect great artists to be nice people. I mean, you think Picasso was a nice guy. I mean, I didn't know, but I never met Picasso, so maybe he was. I doubt it. I really doubt it. And in order to achieve a vision, you have to fight for it. And if you fight for it, maybe not that many people fought quite as hard as Cimino, there is a trail of bleeding bodies behind you.
Literally, in the case of David Lean, there was a famous scene with a woman in the train sequence in Dr. Zhivago where she fell on the tracks and had her leg cut off by the train. And Lean was sort of like, okay, clear that away.
That's
set up for the next shot.
Collateral damage.
Yeah.
Probably only an extra, so therefore that's fine.
Yeah. Or another one was Sergio Leone when he was shooting The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Oh, no, Once Upon a Time in the West. And that famous Canadian actor with a scar who's one of the people waiting, jumped out of a hotel window, killed himself. And Leone ran after the ambulance because he was wearing his costume and he wanted to get the costume. We can shoot a reverse shot. We put a stand in it. And it's just like,
that's what they're like.
Yeah, they're focused on their vision. So let's go back a little bit to the beginning of Cimino and how he, like his family. I mean, this is the bit where I don't want to get into too much detail because of various surprises that sort of pop up. But what was his sort of background? Where was he coming from?
He was born in Brooklyn. His parents were Italian immigrants. I mean, I think they were like second, maybe third generation. Because one of the things I think is incredibly boring in biographies is when they go back to, in 1820, his great, I dump all that. So I just began with that. So when he was 10-ish, they moved out to Long Island, which was safer, leafier, easier than Brooklyn. And they moved to a town called Westbury, which is about an hour out of New York on Long Island. And he had, as you know from the book, there are many different stories. And of course, the great thing about Cimino is there are many different stories about literally everything. And so he essentially he had two brothers. He was the eldest, and he grew up in a middle-class Italian family. They weren't particularly Italian. He didn't really speak Italian at all, and I don't think they spoke Italian at home. And his father was a music publisher, and his mother was a seamstress who specialized in wedding dresses. And they had an utterly conventional, nice, middle-class life.
And so he goes into college and then a career in advertising.
Yes, he did. He went to the University of Michigan and did fine art, and then he went to Yale and did a post-grad course. Again, he always said he did a master's in fine art and then changed and was doing a post-grad architecture degree, but nobody remembers that bit. But he was very, very visual. And at the University of Michigan, there was a sort of student magazine, and he became the design director. And the 4 or 5 cover designs I could find designed by him are all really extraordinary, very forward-looking. And this is in like 58 or so, 59. They looked forward to, those designers in New York like Milton Glaser or Paul Rand or Saul Bass. They were incredibly different from anything that had certainly been on the magazine before. And he painted all his life. Well, he said he painted all his life. I couldn't track. Nobody appeared to have seen any of the paintings. That's a typical Cimino thing. And in fact, his nephew had some, and he gave them to me, black and white drawings, and they're wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So that was one of Cimino's thing about I was a child prodigy, which I don't suppose for a moment he was, but he was a brilliant artist.
It's so interesting having to disentangle this character who's such a fabulist about himself.
Yes.
And I mean, you have at the very beginning of the book, I think, a wonderful moment where you're kind of standing outside his house and wanting to get in.
Yeah.
But there's this feeling that there is a locked room
No, I love that.
That's a straight metaphor, but it's actually literally true as well.
And so we lived in that house for 40 something years. I never did get into it, which I freely admit. Joanne, who owns the house, she lives in New York and doesn't like LA, but there was no way in the world she was going to let me go in the house. So I didn't, but I did go and climb over the fence and take some photographs. Sorry, I lost the thread.
Was it a tall fence?
It was, well, there were two fences. I had to get over the first fence. There's a long driveway leading up to more gates. But the story that I heard is that when he died, the house was just locked up. Nothing was touched. So it was like Miss Havisham in Great Expectations.
Yeah, Miss Havisham's wedding cake.
Exactly. And so that totally fascinated me, particularly, and also the room. I mean, that was probably an exaggeration too, but who cares? It's a great story. And only now is Joanne doing something about the house and clearing it out.
Do you think there's an opportunity there that at some point she'll get in touch with you and say, look, I found a load of stuff you might be interested in?
When hell freezes over.
This, as well, this idea that Joanne said to you, or at least you get this idea that she's the keeper of the flame.
Oh, absolutely.
But how is that flame being kept if she's not putting out her narrative, putting out her version of the story? I mean, she always said, she talks about Michael in the present tense. So she would say, Michael and I have never wanted a biography to be written. And it's true. And she has never sought any publicity at all for herself. She gave a few interviews around the time of Heaven's Gate because she was the producer. She has never been interviewed since then, hates LA, doesn't really have movie friends. And I, like you're finding it odd that she doesn't want to correct the narrative, but she always says, I'm not going to correct these stories, which are all lies. And what she does do is there are a lot of old Cimino scripts, and she goes to Europe sometimes to try, because his career was resuscitated in France, because in France, they love all those kind of failed American directors like Sam Fuller or Nicholas Ray. I don't mean they're failed exactly, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
So Europe is the only place she'll get it together. And that's what she does. And I don't think with a great deal of success. But she was odd in that, though she said she didn't want a biography, she did agree to see me often. But she never, I mean, I thought when I first met her, or just before I first met her, that she wanted to talk, but she didn't know it yet. Sadly, that turned out to be completely untrue. And she didn't want to talk, though she did. I mean, I spent hours with her. So we did talk about all sorts of things. We talked about things other than Cimino, but she never really asked about the book. I sometimes told her who I was seeing, and she would do a kind of, huh, but she never really asked. So I thought maybe she wants to keep me close, to keep an eye on me, but not really. And the one thing I asked her to do, in that I knew she wasn't really, I mean, she did, of course, she did tell me stuff. There, as you'll know, there are so many negative things about Cimino out there on the internet. People saying how ghastly he was, how awful he was. I mean, hundreds of them. And I asked her if she would put me in touch with people who loved Cimino. And she didn't. She wouldn't. And I found I found 5, 6 people, I'm sure there probably were more, but I couldn't find them, who did love him and who were part of his life in the last years in LA, where he was sort of reclusive, but he did have friends and he did go out. And I talked to some people who really did, who worked with him often and did love him, but I found them, she wouldn't even give me them. I mean, she genuinely isn't interested. I don't mean she isn't interested in Cimino. She's genuinely not interested. And it is, to a normal person like you and I, if we are normal people, it is sort of slightly inexplicable why she wouldn't. But like a lot of things with Cimino and her, I can't explain it. I just put it out there and people must make their own minds up.
Yeah, it's almost like, if you were in charge of somebody's legacy, you would want to correct that legacy and preserve the good stuff.
Not at all. And the people he was friendly with in LA, because he was such a great compartmentalizer, none of them knew each other. And he would meet, he loved restaurants. He would have restaurants for each of them. I'm talking 4 or 5 people who didn't know each other. One person he would always go to this restaurant with, another person he'd always go to that restaurant with. So he kept them apart. And the bizarre thing is that none of them ever met Joanne. Even a journalist, film journalist called FX Feeney, who was incredibly helpful, who sadly died, he had been friends with Cimino for 30 years and had never met Joanne. So everybody was kept separate.
And was it possible then that Joanne didn't even know that FX Feeney existed as a friend could the compartmentalization?
No, typical of Joanne, I said I was seeing FX Feeney. She of course knew who he was. And she was very, he's got an axe to grind. He's always after something. And in fact, he knew Cimino after Heaven's Gate, and there was nothing to be after because Cimino's career was in free fall. If you wanted to butter up to somebody, you might butter up Tarantino or Brad Pitt. You wouldn't butter up Cimino because he could not open any doors for you. Go to a restaurant and say, I'm a friend of Michael Cimino. They're not giving you a table. It was very odd that because everybody has betrayed her, and she will certainly think that I have betrayed her.
Do you think she'll read the book?
Well, that's interesting. When like 4 or 5 weeks before the book came out, I sent all the people I talked to a picture of the cover, and just to say, thank you for your contribution. The book's coming out in a month. And I sent it to her, and I've never heard anything. But, if suddenly the phone rang, it's Joanne Corelli, I wouldn't be surprised. She is very unpredictable. And I think, and lots of other people do, I think it is pretty sympathetic to him, even though I don't hide the bad things.
No, absolutely. I thought I came away with it with especially that corrective that you do as you go through Heaven's Gate. But let's come to that in a minute, because I want to. Clint Eastwood. Well, first of all, he doesn't. He starts his career as a director, really as a writer, and then moves into directing, which is kind of again seems a slightly odd path, considering that he's sort of coming from the visual arts. That he should start writing. So that's a skill that he has that maybe some people from that area, that world, wouldn't necessarily automatically have. And then his first directing job is Thunderbolt and Light. Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. With Jeff Bridges and Clint Eastwood, which
actually it's a genre movie. It is Cimino's touch of evil, a kind of genre piece that he turns into something remarkable. It might even be my favorite film of his. But the weird thing was that he was one of the most famous commercials directors in New York. He made a lot of money, but that doesn't have traction in Hollywood. It wasn't like England, where Adrian Lyne, Putnam, Ridley Scott got into movies, because because England and London is so small, the worlds of advertising and film are kind of intricately linked. Whereas certainly in the 60s, all commercials were shot in New York. So LA was a long way away, and being a commercials director didn't open any doors at all. So he was remarkable in that way. And I asked a couple of people who had worked with him on commercials in the 60s and knew that world really well. I asked them both if they could think of anybody else from commercials who had made a huge success in Hollywood, and they couldn't think of anybody. So Joanne said to him, though she denied saying it to him, but everybody else says she said it to him, the only way you're going to be able to make a movie is write a movie for a star and get it to them. And he wrote Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. His agency William Morris also representing Clint Eastwood. And it got sent to Clint Eastwood, who loved it. I mean, Clint Eastwood is partly because he has the power to do it. He always took chances on people, always. He just had a gut instinct and did it. And Cimino, with really not a lot of cards in his hand, said Clint Eastwood couldn't have the movie unless Cimino directed it. But Eastwood worked with quite a lot of first-time directors, and he took the chance. And he gave Cimino a bit of a test by getting him to do the second half of Magnum Force, because John Milius was writing it, but halfway through he was offered the job of directing a movie he had written, which was called Dillinger, with Warren Oates and Richard Dreyfuss. So he jumped ship, and Cimino Eastwood got Cimino to rewrite.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
And that got made. And then they did Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. And he had a very happy experience on it because Clint Eastwood liked him. He knew that Clint Eastwood would sack him if he didn't like him a few days in. And he behaved well. And it's a great film.
Yeah. Do you think that's because he had someone, he didn't have the whip hand, basically? Do you think that contributed to it, that discipline, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, but it's entirely a Cimino movie. And it wasn't recut. It wasn't, Clint Eastwood liked it. And I suppose for the first and probably only time, he had to behave himself because he couldn't do his first film and get sacked off it.
And in a way, that proved a really good calling card for him for The Deer Hunter, that he had
absolutely
he had this film made under budget, on schedule.
Yeah.
So The Deer Hunter, I mean, like with many of these stories that come up, there are a lot of contested versions of sort of how the script was written, who did it. The idea of Russian roulette, I think, seems to have, success has 1,000 fathers.
Yes, exactly.
That is the film as well, which is sort of like the absolute pinnacle and high point of his commercial success. What did you find out that sort of cut through those differing, conflicting?
Well, his stories were to be taken with a giant pinch of salt. As I could put it together, he'd written a movie called Silent Running, which was a rather good science fiction movie in about 1970. And he had co-written it with a writer called Derek Washburn, who was sort of a friend of his. And then he went to Hollywood, and he was called in for a meeting with EMI, a British company. He was offered a script that EMI had called The Man Who Came to Play, which was a really weird script about a couple of hustlers who are in Vietnam and they play Russian roulette for money and they somehow cheat. I can't now remember the precise details. It's not political. The Vietnam War is a kind of backdrop. And the two guys, the two hustlers, they're like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or Danny Glover and Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon. So it is, if you can imagine such a thing, a light-hearted Russian roulette movie. And he came back to EMI and said that he didn't want to do that film. He had another idea he wanted, which just used the Russian roulette idea, nothing else in the movie. And he pitched what was essentially The Deer Hunter, the story of The Deer Hunter. It took him an hour. Marion Rosenberg, who was head of EMI in America, who I talked to a lot, she loved it. She absolutely loved it. And it went to Barry Spikings and Michael Dealey, who had produced The Italian Job and all sorts of things, who would try to break into America. And they loved it too. And it went into production really, really quickly. The thing that Cimino didn't say was that after they'd sent him the original larky Russian roulette script, he had brought Derek Washburn in to do it with him. And they put the pitch together. I also saw Derek Washburn. They put the pitch together, but Cimino didn't say that. And then the problem with it was that, and by the way, Cimino never, ever, ever mentioned the original script where he got the Russian roulette idea from, ever. He was a great credit grabber. And Derek, so EMI commissioned the movie, but for tax reasons, it had to go into production within about 3 months. So like no script, incredibly complicated film, 3 months. In fact, in the end, it was 5 months before it was made. And the problem was he had to prepare the film, locations, etc., etc., etc. And he said it might be a good idea to bring in another writer who he happened to know called Derek Washburn, but he never told EMI that he'd already worked on it. So Derek came out to LA. They worked out in more detail. The original pitch was pretty detailed. Anyway, so Cimino goes off and Derek Washburn writes the script. I mean, it is a bizarre story in terms of timing. The contract was signed for Derek Washburn was hired on December the 6th, 1977, or maybe 76, I can't quite remember. And within 6 weeks, he wrote the script. Cimino came back to LA and sacked him. And Cimino's story was that the script was so terrible, he had to rewrite it. But I've seen that original draft 6 weeks after Derek Washburn was hired, and it is more or less the same as the final script. So Cimino couldn't have rewritten it. So they sacked Derek Washburn. He and Joanne went back to New York. He allegedly rewrote the script, which I don't believe he did. And he was very cruel, Cimino, and he gave interviews saying, Derek Washburn was drunk all the time. The script was complete garbage. So, and then he makes the movie, and there were endless problems with the movie. But as I said, there are endless problems with all movies. And, it was difficult shooting. He was incredibly slow. But as I say in the book, he wasn't slow. He took as much time. So it wasn't like he tried to do it in a day, but it ran over. So it took 2 days. He knew it was going to take 2 days, even though the schedule only had given him 1 day. So he was absolutely meticulous. And if you read both Heaven's Gate and Deer Hunter scripts, every single thing is covered. If the script says, he looks over his shoulder briefly, he looks over his shoulder briefly. I mean, he was an amazingly meticulous filmmaker.
Yeah, I think as you say, that's quite common for filmmakers to push. I remember an interview with Michael Mann, and he was in the middle of shooting Heat, and some sort of production executive came into his trailer while he was having lunch and said, we really need to speed this up, Michael. And Mann just immediately said, right, okay, reset everything. We're going to go again. We're going to go back to the last shot as a way of sort of saying to the executive, this is a Michael Mann picture. I'm going to do this exactly as I want to do it. So that Cimino-esque sort of perfectionism, I just think. Again,
Stephen Bach talked about it as if it was the weirdest thing in the world. But as you rightly say, that's what they do.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that example that you use as well of David Lean is it's sort of that story is told so many times of the sort of the director waiting for the right wave to
Yeah, yeah,
crash. I remember Marlon Brando for One-Eyed Jacks. Also, that was sort of like
yeah.
the story on that film that he was waiting for the right wave or the right cloud to pass.
I'm sure it's true. And again, that's what they do.
He's already on pre-production for Heaven's Gate when the Deer Hunter comes out and sort of
That's right. Yes.
has a sweep of the Oscars.
Yeah.
That's that gives the impression that this guy's snowballing. This guy's going to be this is going to be like a momentous career. What do you feel sort of goes wrong with Heaven's Gate? From the book, I got the impression that it was almost like a loss of nerve on the part of Cimino. Like post the film, the film was made, the film is going through its edit and all the rest of it, and then there's just this sort of like moment where he kind of blinks.
Well, he had amazing confidence in himself and a kind of fuck you attitude to everybody else. And I mean, it's really too well known to go into, how it went over budget and, shot for 7 months and all that. And the shenanigans with United Artists to get his cut of 3 hours, 40 minutes. So it opened. So we didn't lose nerve before that. When the movie opened, it got literally the most vicious reviews any movie has ever had, as far as I can tell. Up there with Verhoeven's Showgirls, perhaps. But the Vincent Canby review in the New York Times said, the failure of Heaven's Gate is so great that you can only assume Cimino made a pact with the devil to achieve the success of The Deer Hunter, and it's payback time. I mean, vicious reviews. And at the premiere, everybody was fleeing at the end. And then he lost his nerve and said to United Artists he'd like to recut the movie. With the usual, we didn't have enough time to cut it, i.e. a year wasn't long enough. And that was a huge failure of nerve, partly because, and United Artists agreed to it, but it was entirely Cimino's desire. If anybody had thought about it, Cimino obviously panicked, and I can understand sort of why he panicked, except he wasn't a panicky guy, but he panicked. What they were, and of course, United Artists knew they'd seen the stuff, they knew what was there. And if you cut an hour out of it, it would be the same but shorter. There weren't any new sequences, there wasn't this, there wasn't that. And when I saw, which is what I saw first, the second cut at 2 hours 40, I thought if I ever saw the long version, I might understand the story a bit better, i.e., what is John Hurt doing there? And when I saw the long version, I didn't understand any more because there was no sequences were cut from the long version. They were just all made shorter. And the battle at the end, instead of being an hour, was cut down to half an hour. But the story is exactly the same. And when the reviews came out, one of them, Stanley Kaufman or somebody, said, this is like a fat man who's gone on a diet but doesn't look any better. And that, I think that's true. And I certainly don't think the 2 hours, 40 minutes is a kind of travesty. It's just shorter. And Cimino sort of made out that it had been butchered, but in fact, he cut it. And the failure of nerve was simply that to the industry, it looked like United Artists and Cimino had spent 7 months and spent $44 million to make this masterpiece, but they suddenly agreed with the critics that it was terrible. So it became a kind of laughing stock. And if they had stuck to their guns, stuck with the 3 hour, 40 minute version, it wouldn't have made any money, but they would have retained their dignity. They would have had the courage of their convictions. And I think it was a big mistake of Cimino and very unusual for him to lose his nerve.
Do you think he deeply regretted that or saw it in that way? Or
I don't think, I just actually don't know that because he never really talked much about it.
Right.
I don't actually know.
So Heaven's Gate, the narrative becomes that it destroys United Artists,
Yeah.
and it's blamed for a lot of things, which you kind of dispute, right?
Yeah, well, it isn't just I take a different view. I found the stuff. I mean, in the year that the year after Heaven's Gate was released, United Artists made $22 million profit. That had a lot of other flops. And the story that it bankrupted the studio is just completely untrue. What he could be accused of is making United Artists slightly lose their appetite for filmmaking because it was such a horrible experience. But United Artists was bought by a company called Transamerica in the late 60s for $180 million. And it was sold to MGM for $380 million. That is not a studio going bankrupt, but yet the myth continued and still continues. And it just isn't true.
Do you think there was a sort of a night of the long knives for Cimino because he'd sort of made some enemies?
Yes,
made his enemies along the way.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of things were blamed on Cimino. The fact that all those auteur directors, Bogdanovich, Coppola, not Scorsese so much, Robert Altman, after those early successes like Last Picture Show, Easy Rider, I've now run out of ones, but you'll know them.
Taxi Driver.
Well, as I say, Scorsese was
Godfather.
always different. But the movies they made after those first cheap successes, obviously they were more expensive, they had more power, and, they all flopped. The movies that Coppola did, like The Conversation. The difference is The Conversation is a great, great, great movie, but it flopped. But he did some not good movies, as did Altman, as did Brian De Palma.
Even Spielberg has 1941.
Exactly. And Cimino was sort of blamed for the fact that other people had failed. And it was easy to put it on one guy.
Yeah, it was sort of like, let's put all these geniuses back in their box. Again, going back to Orson Welles, a little bit like RKO, saying, we're not going to have any genius anymore.
Yeah.
So his post-Heaven's Gate career makes for kind of sad reading. Although I quite like Desperate Hours, and I quite like...
wow.
Year of the Dragon is
lots of people love Year of the Dragon,
right?
And at least it's a proper Cimino movie, even though I think it's got a lot of things wrong with it. Lots of people love it, and I can see why they love it. It's a proper Cimino movie. I think Mickey Rourke is terrible in it. The Chinese Girlfriend is absolutely terrible in it, but it has a lot of great things in it. John Lone is wonderful. The shootout in the restaurant is wonderful. The battle on the bridge at the end it's full of great things.
And the Desperate Hours, no.
No, well, I think that the problem with Desperate Hours was he had somehow lost his feel. The script was written for the main character, not Mickey Rourke, but the father of the family that Mickey Rourke invades, was a mid-30s American chaser after the American dream. And he was played by Anthony Hopkins. It just doesn't work. And the house they live in, which was built in a studio, is the most grandiose house. You can't quite believe they would, I don't mean they were poor, but it's like a castle. It is huge. And I just didn't believe a word of it. And it's Desperate Hours. It was a novel. It was a play. It was a movie directed by William Wyler. It wasn't crappy material. Other people had made good stuff out of it, but he couldn't, because I think, Year of the Dragon, he was more or less in control of. The other movies, he certainly didn't have final cut. They were pretty conventional movies, the last three, but somehow he just couldn't work unless it was all him. He just, other people like Orson Welles. When I compared Thunderbolt and Lightfoot to Touch of Evil, the difference was that Thunderbolt and Lightfoot was Cimino's first movie. Touch of Evil was Orson Welles' 12th movie, whatever it was. But very cleverly, he managed to make it an Orson Welles movie. He rewrote it, And it was an Orson Welles movie, and people love it. It's a great movie, even though, of course, it was recut. But it wasn't recut like Beneficent Ambersons. It was tinkered with by the studio, but it's still a masterpiece.
Yeah,
Cimino just couldn't do that.
And he had, what was it, the Sicilian as well, which was...
The Sicilian is really, really a dreadful movie.
Right.
Desperate Hours, I think, is a terrible movie. Sunchaser, the last movie, has some really good things in it. They all flopped. The Year of the Dragon probably just about made money. The others all were huge flops. I mean, Sunchaser, which cost $30 million, grossed $30,000. I mean, it was literally hardly shown. And it's not a terrible movie.
And he was, I mean, I don't know. It's like usually in Hollywood, they love their second acts. You know, they love their their comebacks, and you know, the career of Mel Gibson is almost entirely made of comebacks and second acts. But nobody wanted to do that for Cimino, or Cimino himself was just highly resistant and self-destructive.
Well, I don't think he was actually offered anything after Sunchaser in 1996. He wrote a lot of projects, though who knows how many.
Which is in this famous locked room that we
exactly. And, you know, he turned some of them into novels. He wrote novels and turned some of them into screenplays. Joanne said it was impossible to know because there were so many different versions of everything. And Man's Fate, which is a big epic set in the Chinese Revolution in whenever it was, in the 30s. I told you I only knew about movies. Chinese history is beyond me. You know, he did go some way to getting it, but he never got the money. And the people I talked to said, you know, he wouldn't compromise on the budget. Even then, you know, if he didn't get enough money to make it, he wouldn't make it. And it's sort of impressive. And I think possibly, though he would never admit it, he was kind of frightened of doing another movie. Somebody told me that Irvin Kershner had wanted to do a movie with him. I mean, he was a director, but he was going to produce the movie. And Cimino wouldn't even meet him. You know, he had lost his confidence in some way. I mean, not surprisingly.
And he's...
And what didn't happen to him was what happened to Robert Altman, who was out in the wilderness for a long, long time and made some pretty terrible movies, and suddenly came back with The Player, I guess.
Yeah, The Player, and then Shortcuts.
And Shortcuts, The Player, and he came back at that was either a second act or a third act or maybe a fourth act, but he came back and did critically well-received movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And after he's sort of out of the picture in terms of making films or getting films made, then you have this chapter in his life which has, I don't know, it sort of, he becomes, you know, locked in his Xanadu. There's the plastic surgery. There's the cross-dressing. Yeah. There's also like a reference that is made. I think you quote his memoir where he's talking about anorexia.
Yeah.
And so there was all this sort of adding to the legend, if you like.
Yeah.
And
I mean, he was. You've seen the photographs. He was always a kind of chunky guy, and always had, I don't mean weight problems, but his weight would go up and down. He became literally like a stick insect or a chipolata stick. You know, and the thing about anorexia, I mean, that book, which was only published in France, that memoir, I think he was doing a kind of 8.5, writing about a director called Michael Cimino, but quite whether the Michael Cimino in the book was Michael Cimino, it's hard to tell. It's like a weird dream, the whole book. It's not long, it's about 50 pages. It's like a weird dream, and obviously some of it is true and some of it isn't true. And it's hard to tell which bits are which. And the drinking, I mean, there are people said, who I talked to in Newham Wells, said, you know, he had a big drink problem. Other people, I mean, Joanne said he never drank at all. Somebody else told me he never drank. So as usual, he was showing different personae. So how true that book is, I don't really know, and nobody will ever know, but it's rather kind of gripping. And he talks about suicide and full of bizarre, but it kind of rambles like all over the place. It isn't like a coherent narrative, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, just like his whole life isn't like a
Yes,
coherent narrative.
exactly.
You know, and somebody visits his house at one point and opens the fridge, and there's nothing in the fridge except
that's like a great story. A half-eaten sandwich and a half bottle of champagne. That's it in a whole fridge. And not a fridge like you have or I have, one of those Beverly Hills fridges, which is the size of a room.
It's just amazing. And then there's the thing about the cross-dressing that comes in, and his what nowadays there would be something, a context in which to place it of gender fluidity, but he's built himself up as this real machismo.
Sure. Endlessly talked about his girlfriends, but nobody ever met any of them.
Yes. Yeah, and that was there was one reference to girls, like almost everywhere he goes, like when he's shooting the Vietnam sequences in the Deer Hunter, it's like, right. I had a couple of girlfriends, and it's like a girl in every port.
Girl in every port, exactly.
I mean,
and I don't think there was anybody in his life really apart from Joanne. But again, were they lovers? Were they whatever? Who knows?
I mean, that's what's so fascinating about the book is after reading it, usually I would be frustrated if I got to the end of a biography and I felt like I really don't know this guy at all. But here, the really don't know this guy at all is the essential ingredient of who this guy is.
Which is just as well.
Yeah. What did, when you came away from it, having sort of researched it and having got to know some of these people around him, did you feel like, and considering the fact that he'd had this fearsome reputation, did you feel much more sympathy for him than you had done initially?
Yes, I did. I think he was a sort of flawed, I mean, are we all? But he was sort of his own destruction. And I was really moved by it. And I was moved by the woman I talked to, his mentor in the cross-dressing world, which I didn't make any comment on because nobody wants to hear me talking about cross-dressing. It was a sort of dreamlike thing. And I just put her narrative together, didn't say what I thought. I just put it out there, and I think her relationship with him was rather moving.
There's a beautiful quote you have from her where she says, she was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. It's like that. Maybe that was who you were supposed to be, man.
Yes.
Maybe that's who you should have gone with.
Yeah. So it was a sort of sad end, but I put in, I mean, did I exaggerate it a bit? Maybe. An uplift ending, which was, the resuscitation of Heaven's Gate. And of course, it is a great movie. And it has got resuscitated, and that was wonderful. And he was immensely moved and touched by the reception it got. Yeah, and who can blame him after 30 years in the wilderness?
Yeah, and being proved right about something as well.
Yes.
When he gets the reward, but at the same time, there's a sort of grace note of him receiving the award at Locarno, and kind of sabotaging his own Q&A with.
That is, look, it's on YouTube. It is hilarious.
Oh, right, okay.
And I just basically what I did was a kind of transcript of the footage. I look at it on YouTube. It is hilarious. I don't mean you're laughing at him, but he's so eccentric, so bizarre, and very lovable. Just put up Locarno Cimino. You'll find it. It lasts about an hour. It's fabulous. I cut it down a lot, obviously, but it's wonderful. And the thing about the man in the wheelchair, if you remember that bit, it's wonderful, bonkers.
And the guy who mentions Joanne's husband,
David Mansfield,
exactly, and he's like, don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, listen, Charles, I ask everybody to recommend a film book for us. What film book would you like to recommend to our listeners?
Does it have to be one?
No, it can be as many as you like.
It's not like Desert Island Discs. I tell you, I was thinking, because you said, I think there are two fiction ones. One is Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion, which is an extraordinary book from about 1970. I mean, Joan Didion was absolutely part of Hollywood. They lived there, she and her husband. And though I think she's a wonderful novelist, she was a terrible screenwriter. A Star Is Born.
The Chris Christopherson version, yes.
Terrible screenwriter. But then so was Gore Vidal. You know, that's novelists for you. Anyway, Play It As It Lays is about an actress married to a director who's making a film and has a kind of long nervous breakdown. It is it is LA in the 70s. The drugs, the freeways, the independent. It's wonderful. So that's one. The other fiction is Scott Fitzgerald's Pat Hobby stories. You ever read those?
No.
Oh, get them. They're in What Penguin Do. It's in one volume. There's about 10 short stories about this guy called Pat Hobby, who was a drunken failed screenwriter, i.e. Scott Fitzgerald. And he's always scrambling to get another job as a screenwriter. And it's sad and it's very funny. And I think it's better than The Last Tycoon, which is another great movie. Okay, there are those. I think, though, I dare say everybody will say this, I think Peter Biskin's Easy Riders, Raging Bulls is just a great, wonderful book, which I obviously used a lot. Wonderful book. And Peter Biskin helped me a bit. He's a very nice guy. Julia Phillips's You'll Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again is the best scurrilous, gossipy book. I think that's it.
Brilliant.
I could come up with hundreds more, but I won't.
There are some good recommendations there. Joe Didion, I love that novel. It's such a great novel. Although I did like Panic in Needle Park, which is one of her screenplays.
No, I agree. Panic in Needle Park is probably the best of them. The best of them. Did you see Up Close and Personal?
Yeah. No.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to do one more book. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Her husband, John Gregory Dunn, he bizarrely in the late 60s, by 67, he asked Dick Zanuck at 20th Century Fox if he could come and just sit at the studios and write a book about what was going on. It's called The Studio. It is hilarious. The full story of Dr. Dolittle. It is absolutely wonderful.
Oh, brilliant! That's going straight on my list. Yeah. I've heard of some of those, but the F. Scott Fitzgerald. I remember talking to James Ivory a couple of years ago, and I asked him if there was any any adaptation that he wished he'd done, and and that was one of his. He'd been working on that for ages, and it just never came off. Brilliant! So it's time I read them. You
should.
Super. Listen, Charles, thank you so much for talking to me, and congratulations on the book. Cimino is a brilliant read. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to you, but I love doing the book. And good luck if you can cut this interview down into anything kind of that has a narrative through line. So, but that's your problem, not mine.
So that was my conversation with Charles. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. It was really great to hear his view on Cimino, and a figure. Honestly, we tried not to spoil the book because there are some twists and turns in the book which left me very, very much surprised. I don't know if you come away from the book with any sort of certainty about who Michael Cimino exactly was. But in a way, that's kind of the beauty of it. The locked room, the enigma wrapped in a puzzle, buried in a mystery. I'm not sure what the quote about Byron was originally, but it's something along those lines. He's recommended books. There were too many for me to list here, but it was Joan Didion's Play It As It Lays, which is a novel. It's great to have someone recommend some novels as well. Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, Peter Biskind. The F. Scott Fitzgerald stories, which I'm going to look up myself and dip into. And I think there was John Griffin Dunn's The Studio as well, which I think has been nominated before as a recommended book. So that's super. That's great. I'm not entirely sure what our next episode is going to be. We've got a Mario Bava biography coming up. Not necessarily biography, actually. Maybe just a critical study of Mario Bava. We're going to be looking at that. There are some other people who I've contacted and who were arranged to book. One of them is George Stevens Jr., a wonderful and historic, one of the founding members of the AFI, the American Film Institute, and I'm currently reading his memoir in preparation for the interview, and it is riveting, absolutely riveting. It's a real honor to be able to talk to such an important and significant figure in the world of cinema. Okay, so I guess I've talked for enough. I don't want to try your patience too much, so I will simply thank Ali Harwood for his artwork. I shall also thank Elliot Atkins for his music, which is always perfect. And I will thank you too, listener, for staying until the end, if indeed you're still here. And until next week, please take care.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.